evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, happy Monday. Just for fun sometime, give a little civics test to people in your neighborhood. Ask them, if you wanted to take over a country, how would you do it? And here's the answer you are likely to get from all of them. They would say, well, first, you've got to get the most votes. They're Americans. That's what they believed. And they believe it because that's how things have worked in this country for hundreds of years. It's called representative democracy. But we should remember that that is not at all how things work in most other places or ever have. They don't have representative democracy. In most places, at most times, if you wanted to take over a country, first you had to control its military, the guys with guns, as Mark Milley once memorably put it. The army is essential for political control. Government dictates have no meaning without the credible threat of force to back them up. Guns are to laws what gold is to paper currency. It gives it value and strength. In a democratic system, the military serves and protects the entire population, no matter who they voted for. That's what democracy is. In an authoritarian system, by contrast, the army is the enforcement apparatus of a specific political party. That's the difference between the two systems. It's worth remembering that, given what we're seeing happen all around the world right now. The German Defense Ministry, for example, recently announced it's dismantling its best-trained special operations unit. That's called the KSK. Dozens of KSK operators have recently been fired. Now, none of them have committed any kind of crime. The ruling party in Germany simply determined that they were not loyal enough. They had the wrong political view, so they got canned. As the German defense minister put it, the KSK has, quote, come under the influence of an unhealthy understanding of elites. An unhealthy understanding of elites, says the elite? Has there ever been a more revealing quote than that? In other words, anyone who doesn't think we're impressive must be fired immediately. Does that sound familiar to you? It should, because it's not just happening in Germany. In Australia, which until recently was a pretty free country, politicians just called in the military to enforce their totalitarian COVID restrictions using violence if necessary, and it is sometimes necessary. Sydney is under martial law. Now, that is a shocking attack on the Western understanding of civil liberties, the most basic civil liberties. And yet the Australian government, most of its media, and its intellectual class refuse even to acknowledge that. Instead, they insist that the real threat to Australia is, are you ready for this? White supremacy. Once again, sound familiar? It goes without saying that none of this has anything to do with COVID or racism, obviously. It's about power. That's all it's about. In this country, the slide from democracy began earlier this year, just after Joe Biden's inauguration. The new Secretary of Defense, a defense industry shill called Lloyd Austin, explained that his very first and single most pressing job was to root out what he referred to as extremism in the U.S. military. He put the entire military on hold to do this. So the question is, what is this extremism? What does it consist of? But Lloyd Austin never told us. And yet, if you want to know the answer, you will notice how very excited, how thrilled members of one specific political party were when they heard this news.
We absolutely need to look at any type of white supremacists that are still members of the military and how they're being targeted for recruitment by white supremacist groups. And we need to weed this out. This whole idea of police officer on police officer violence with those officers who have been turned by white extremists is really scary to me. And I know it's got to be scary for the other police officers.
I am considering legislation to create a standalone punitive article in the Uniform Code of Military Justice to address violent extremism in the ranks and to send a message of deterrence that this kind of conduct will not be tolerated in the military.
We've seen a lot of reports highlighting how many of the attackers were veterans. And there's been really a growing recognition that the military has to do more to address extremism in its ranks.
White supremacy in the military is a crisis, said the most unscrupulous people in Washington, but that's not what it was about. What you just saw on tape was, in fact, a power grab. The message, no one who does not support our political party is allowed to bear arms. That's what they're saying very clearly. And because it's the Democratic Party doing the talking here, there was also, needless to say, a vicious racial angle, too, because there always is. Watch Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee explain.
The Guard is 90-some-odd%, I believe, male. Only about 20% of white males voted for Biden. You got to figure that in the Guard, which is predominantly more conservative, and I see that on my social media and we know it, they're probably not more than 25% of the people that are there protecting us who voted for Biden. The other 75% are in the class that would be the large class of folks who might want to do something.
So if you're white, you're dangerous, says a sitting member of Congress. That clip was from January. Of course, that was the same month that Lloyd Austin announced he was cracking down on this extremism. Then a few months later, reading from the same song sheet, Mark Milley told the U.S. Congress he was working to root out white rage in the military. Okay. And yet, after all of this, because we're keeping score, as of today, we're not aware of a single white supremacist on active duty who has been discovered by the Pentagon and fired. Not one. So that threat didn't exist at all. It was fake. That was all a lie. Several National Guard troops were relieved of duty around the inauguration, though no one has ever explained why they were fired. Then a senior commander in the Space Force, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer, lost his job, and we know why. His crime was criticizing Marxism. That's a firing offense now. Then in August, Lloyd Austin came up with a new political purity test. This one was specifically designed to separate the obedient from the free. Can't have any of the latter category. Austin said he planned to fire anyone in the entire armed services who would not submit to the COVID-19 vaccination shot. Didn't matter whether they had natural immunity or not, as many in the military do. Their personal moral or religious objections were totally irrelevant. The point was to bow before his authority and the authority of the Democratic Party. No excuses, no exceptions. Quote, I have determined, Austin said, that mandatory vaccination against COVID-19 is necessary to protect the force and defend the American people. Period. No debate. So what's the scientific justification for this? Well, of course, there isn't any. There is zero scientific basis for any of this. The fighting strength of the military is young, healthy people, virtually all of them at extremely low risk of dying from COVID. In fact, to this day, only 46 members of the entire U.S. military have died from the coronavirus over the last year and a half. Suicides, by contrast, kill many, many times more. In just a few months last year, 156 servicemen killed themselves. So military suicide is an actual crisis that the Pentagon might want to address. Lloyd Austin might want to look into that. But no, that would get the Democratic Party nothing. The point of mandatory vaccination is to identify the sincere Christians in the ranks, the free thinkers, the men with high testosterone levels, and anyone else who does not love Joe Biden and make them leave immediately. It's a takeover of the U.S. military. Here's how they're doing it. This show has just obtained a PowerPoint that the Army is using to justify mandatory vaccines to the troops. This is an actual slide from it on your screen. You will notice there the sympathetic portrayal of Satanism. How many children were sacrificed to Satan because of the vaccine? The slide reads, apparently sarcastically. Then the presentation proceeds to list the so-called tenets of Satanism, which are taken straight from the Temple of Satanism website. So here you have the United States Army doing PR for Satanism. The rest of the presentation is less shocking than that, but it's utterly shoddy and dishonest. For example, it falsely claims that only 3 people have died from taking the COVID vaccine. Reports collected by the Biden administration itself indicate that number is actually in the thousands. So we called the Army about this today, and they conceded the PowerPoint you just saw is absolutely real. Troops saw it, but it was somehow not approved by Army leadership. They did not explain how that works or what they're going to do about it. We do know the vaccine mandate is taking a terrible toll on the U.S. military and on this country's ability to defend itself at a very volatile time in the world. Already, 3 members of the CIA paramilitary teams that first entered Afghanistan after 9/11, remember them? They got there before the military. 3 members of that team have been suspended for not getting vaccinated. They're being told to await disciplinary proceedings. Meanwhile, an Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Douglas Haig, just announced that he's resigning from the military rather than take medicine that he does not want or need. In a statement, Haig said he was, quote, incapable of subjecting myself to the unlawful, unethical, immoral, and tyrannical order to sit still and allow a serum to be injected into my flesh against my will and better judgment, end quote. There are many like him in the U.S. military. The Navy just informed the most famous unit in the entire services, the Navy SEALs, that members will be forced to leave if they don't take the shot. It does not matter if they have natural immunity, and many do. Doesn't matter if they have a valid religious or medical exemption. If they don't submit to the order, they cannot deploy and they'll have to leave the SEALs. The deadline for this is almost immediately. Now, to be clear, just in case you're wondering if this is in response to some kind of crisis, we don't believe a single Navy SEAL has died of COVID, and that makes sense. These are some of the healthiest people, not just in America, but in the world. They're the Olympic athletes of the military. Many of them have had the virus, they live in close quarters, and they've recovered. That means they have more natural immunity than the vaccine could ever provide. And yet, as of tonight, we're hearing that hundreds of Navy SEALs face being fired imminently for refusing to take the shot. Now, keep in mind, there are only about 2,500-ish active duty Navy SEALs. Each one of them costs at least $500,000 for the U.S. government to train. So imagine the effect on our country's military readiness of this. It's horrifying. If you love the country, you would not do this. You would also not disable our hospitals by forcing nurses to resign because they don't want to take the shot. You'll notice, by the way, in the case of the Navy SEALs and more broadly the U.S. military, that none of the members of Congress who claim to care so much about the military, they talk about it all the time, defense hawks like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and so many others, none of these people have said a single word about any of this. They have not risen to defend these guys because they don't care.